Hi everyone, Holly from Safe for Kids here, and I'm thrilled today to be speaking with the author of this book, Shannon Molloy. I saw Shannon on the drum. I'm friends with Dr. Salter on Facebook, and he said he was going on the drum. So I thought, oh, Michael Salter, who doesn't want to watch that? So I jumped on it, and then I saw that you were being interviewed. And listening to your story, I raced out the very next day to buy your book. I was thrilled to see that it was in, I actually got it from Big W, and that really shocked me that they're so mainstream. What a huge honour to have it on such a big scale.
Yeah,
So
huge.
thank you for agreeing to talk with me and telling
Oh,
us
thank
about your
you.
book.
Thank you so much.
So would you like to tell everybody about why you wrote the book? And it's your second, isn't it?
It is, yeah, yeah. So it's part memoir, part journalistic investigation, looking into the lifelong traumatic impacts of child sexual abuse on men. And it came about somewhat selfishly from me wanting to understand more about what happened to me when I was 5 and how that shaped the rest of my life. You know, as I struggled, the older I got to kind of keep all the worms in the can, so to speak. And it began talking about it in therapy, and then meeting some other men that I sought out to sort of see what common issues we might be facing, then doing a lot of research and speaking to a lot of experts, and then kind of realizing that not only is this so common, the abuse of boys, but there's very little out there for male survivors, particularly adult male survivors. And I kind of naively thought going in that abuse was something that predominantly or overwhelmingly happened to girls, whereas the data shows that's not the case. And the experts on the ground, anecdotally, believe that it's probably 50-50. It's about on par. The
Well,
difference is,
I was lucky enough to speak to Professor Frida Briggs before she passed away. And in Frida's work, she actually believed boys were more sexually abused than girls.
wow,
Boys are
wow.
just less likely to tell us.
Far less
So,
likely. And I think that's the thing that kind of haunted me, was, the Royal Commission into Institutionalized Abuse did a data analysis and found that men on average take about 35 years to ever tell anybody for the first time what happened to them when they were boys. And I found that really kind of horrifying, and then realized that it had been 30 years for me before I said it almost, for the first time in a therapy session. And the impact of that silence and the impact of carrying that burden alone for so long is significant, not just on the men, but on the people around them that love them, and in many cases, the broader community. So that's kind of how the book came to life.
well, I'm so glad you wrote it because it's so important that we hear people's voices and that it's not just a statistic. And when I was so blessed to have spent some time with Frida, and she was saying when she was interviewing men, um, they didn't actually consider what happened to them because it might have been another child
Yeah,
so rather than say, were you sexually abused, she would say, tell me about your first sexual encounter.
yeah,
Totally flipped it. But in other survivors that I've interviewed, male survivors that are been abused by males, I've just been made aware recently of two gentlemen. One's late in his 60s and one's about 55, both abused as children, but it made them question their sexuality. And for me, because one of the things we teach children is about their early warning signs, the body signals we get when we feel unsafe. And so we know that, you get butterflies in your tummy, your heart racing, your legs feel like jelly. But in my experience and talking to survivors, I think one of the problems is that when boys are touched, they get an erection. So they think
yeah,
that's consent.
yeah,
It's not consent. You get goosebumps when you're cold, you shiver. That's your body's reaction to that.
yes,
And so one of the gentlemen I know, because he thought he was gay, never had an adult relationship ever because he's not gay. He doesn't,
yeah,
that's just not his thing. But he thinks he's gay. And then another gentleman that I spoke to, was saying that, you know, he thought he was bisexual for the same reason.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to get my head around, how can I incorporate the way the body responds, so that to say, Pete, if you get an erection, it's how your body's designed. It's not
Yeah.
consent. It's not because you liked it. That's how your body.
Hardwiring. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's really complicated, and it's something that came up a lot with the men. So I spoke to about 12 men, 5 of whom appear in the book, but 12 all up. Some that just wanted to give their story and didn't want to, you know, put it out there. Others who kind of, you know, at the last minute felt a little uncomfortable, which was totally fine. But in terms of the sexuality split, maybe a third at most were men who are now gay. They had questioned, and myself included, whether what happened to them had made them gay, which of course is not the case. That's not how science and biology work. But the other two-third were straight men, some of them married, some with kids, who this complex question mark had hung over them for so long, purely because of the physiological response that their body had to this instance. And some of them were still struggling with it, you know, wondering, oh, what if, and feeling a lot of guilt about how their body responded. And so it's just another layer of complexity to the male condition when it comes to this awful issue. So much of it's tied up in shame, notions of masculinity, kind of, you know, the community role of men. And it's just, yeah, it's a really toxic thing to have to deal with, particularly at such an early age.
And so for me, because I start with children 3 to 17, and I'm fortunate to work with a whole gamut. I was watching an episode of Oprah, and she was interviewing an African-American male actor who said that he was sexually abused by 3 different family members from the age from 5 to 10. But he kept saying, my body would fail me. So I teach the children the thumb up for safe and the thumb down for unsafe. And I'm sitting there going, oh my goodness, I need to talk about this. So I came up with the thumb in the middle for confused, because sexual touching can be confusing because you're not quite sure if you're safe and you're not quite sure if you're unsafe. So that's how I talk with young children about, you know, that sort of thing. But I think I really need to develop something to talk to, you know, young men from 11 upwards around. It doesn't, you know, your body's, that's how it's designed, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because after talking to other survivors, you know, some of the reasons, like you mentioned, shame, but from talking to other survivors, the 2 things that come across is that they didn't tell because people think they're gay, or will I become a pedophile? And
Yeah.
of course, both of those aren't true.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's a whole, for men, it just must be so complex. And
Yeah.
I was interested to read in your book that you went to Reddit, because I just
Yeah.
think that's a toxic environment.
It
And
can be.
how
There is
brave.
there are some really great little communities on there, and I've been lurking there for years. I find it really fascinating, particularly how men engage with it in kind of a really free way that I don't think they would in real life. So yeah, I went to Reddit. I thought, when I started kind of work on the book and the idea of the book, and formal sort of approaches to survivors to see if they wanted to take part. I thought this would take several months to find enough men who were willing to talk to me and willing to go into a book that the world will see. It was wrapped up in a matter of weeks. It was so easy to find men who, many of them had never told anybody before what happened to them, and were just waiting to feel safe enough to talk about it. And he's a total stranger who is putting it out, you know, 80,000 words of it out into the world for everyone to see.
The big thick
Yeah,
book.
yeah. And they somehow, I think it was the shared lived experience. They felt safe enough to talk. And I never really got over the enormity of that, of being the first person to hear these stories, and the huge responsibility that I felt, and privilege as well. But it's the physiological thing is is interesting because also as part of the book, I went to a support group for men, and there was a guy there talking about, you know, his struggle with his sexuality in his teenage years. And then I think he was in therapy himself, and, you know, spoke about the erection factor. And the therapist said to him, have you ever been on a bus where it's really bumpy and,
Yeah.
you know, and you sort of, you know, you get an erection, and the guy's like, yeah, yeah. And he's like, do you think that means that you want to have sex with a bus? Like, that's how the male body is wired,
Yes.
for evolutionary reasons. And so that he said it was like a switch in his head being flicked. And I felt kind of the same as well. And that removes so much of the guilt of, did I participate in this thing, even though I was 5, or I think he was 7 from memory. So it's, yeah, there's so many layers to it.
And now we're all going consent mad. I've been teaching consent for 35 years, but now it's a thing this year, thanks to beautiful Chanel Quintos. Finally, we're talking about it. But again, it doesn't mean you consented. And that's why this guy in the Oprah thing kept saying his body would fail him. And he didn't have the words around it either. So my whole thing is to try and give children the words. It is not children's job to keep themselves safe. It is our jobs as adults. But adults can't always be there. And your story is so, because it was another child.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was 5. He was an older boy who lived in the neighborhood. We kind of met by chance, and pretty quickly this thing developed, and it happened on and off for several years. And basically any opportunity that we were alone, it was very coercive. He was very manipulative. At times he was quite threatening. But again, because of the physiological response, because I didn't immediately stop being friends with him, I felt in some way complicit. I felt like it was my fault, and I felt deep, deep shame and terror that anyone should ever find this thing out, and that I would get in trouble. And so much of that comes back to just having no clue how the body works, no sense of what's right and what's wrong, and no kind of ownership over my body, and so I was just totally out of my depth. And even if I wouldn't have known how to verbalize what had happened to my parents or to a teacher. So the kind of work you're doing is so vital, because that's one of the prevention tools, is empowering kids with knowledge, age appropriate knowledge.
Yeah. So can I ask, when you were 5, what did you call your body parts? Did you have words for it? Because when I interviewed the young lady who was abused by a female, she said, Holly, it happened before I was 9, and I didn't have words for my private parts.
Yeah.
So she couldn't disclose because she didn't have the words.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it would have been. Something very, very sort of innocent and juvenile, like doodle or something like that. Whatever was the colloquialism in the late 80s, early 90s. But even that, like, it was rude, and it was a taboo and off topic, and I kind of just knew, like, not to, I don't know, like, I had weird hang-ups about taking my shirt off to go swimming at the pool or the beach, like everything about my body was shameful and secret, and the destruction of that, when then this horrible thing happened, just compounded that enormously. So I didn't have the language, I didn't have the knowledge, and what I knew, the little bits I knew about it, were kind of wrapped up in secrecy, and that just obviously makes everything so much worse.
And now we've got the complexity of children having access to pornography as well, on top of everything else.
Yeah.
I say that we need to talk about pornography from 6 at the latest. I don't call it pornography with 6-year-olds, we call them private pictures and private movies. But as I was telling you before we started the actual interview, I wrote this children's book because I had a principal ring me. He had 6 separate cases of children exhibiting harmful sexual behaviour in other children. And so in the book, it teaches 5 private rules. No one's allowed to touch your private parts. If they do, they're breaking the law. And if it happened, it's not your fault. So we're very clear. No one's allowed to show you private pictures. No one's allowed to take private pictures of you. You're not allowed to take private pictures of yourself, and you're not allowed to touch anybody else's private parts. If you do, you're breaking the law. So, you know, there's a lot of programs out there that are wishy-washy and assume children will fill in the blanks. But for me, I say we're always Vegemite. I'm never going to be vanilla. You're either going to love us or you're going to hate us. But, you know, because I get to stand in front of 4,500 children a year, teaching some part of my program, the stories that kids are telling me, you know, they're seeing pornography, they're thinking dad's doing that to mum, and if we don't give them the language to be able to tell us,
Yeah.
So you have a daughter.
Yes, and all of this terrifies me.
I bet it does.
It did long before I was a dad, because you know my day job is as a journalist, and I've written at multiple points about the kind of the mainstream influence of pornography on adolescents and children. I did an interview a couple of years ago now. I can't remember with who, but for a story about how common porn had become, and this researcher said that there's been an explosion in the number of instances of serious physical abuse in girls around 11 to 13 from the violent, penetrative nature of sex. And then, you know, then there are a whole range of more serious issues in that age group up. And at the time, I remember thinking 11 and 12, like that can't be right. But then one of my best mates, she's got a daughter who's 7, and they live in a very affluent area, and they go to a very well-regarded school, and they've just had an incident where an 11-year-old has had a video filmed of her engaging in sex with another boy in her class, and that's been distributed, and it's kind of set off these shockwaves, and everyone's so surprised. And she's a journalist as well, and we both kind of said to each other, like, this is just the world, unfortunately. Like, this isn't some freak occurrence. This is what kids are encountering every day. I mean, I remember, you know, it was the kind of analog version of it where someone's dad would leave a pornography magazine in the bathroom or, you know, under the bed or something, and it would get passed around. But now it's on every single device that a child has access to, whether you allow them to or not. So it is really terrifying on how you police that. I don't think you can. I don't think there's an effective way to just prevent your child from seeing that, which is why I just come back to educating them, and not age appropriate, but not sugarcoating it, because the world isn't sugarcoated, and the realities of the world are so grim that if you don't equip your kid in the best possible way, you're doing them a disservice. So yeah, it's terrifying.
So how old is your daughter?
She's about to turn 2.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Well,
so I don't know. It's just I've covered the worst of humanity as a journalist for 17 years. So yeah, it's but you know, all you can do is your best, I guess, is the message, and your best should be informed by the latest research, the best resources on offer.
And open communication. I wrote 2 books to help adults have these conversations, because people don't know how to start a conversation about porn with a 6-year-old. But books are, for me, a really good way to, you know, springboard, because, you know, even if you're uncomfortable yourself, you're reading my words, not necessarily, and especially for boys, because boys don't like face-to-face stuff in my experience. They like either sideways, lying down next to them. I tell parents in my workshops, if you want your teenage son to know something, either tell him when he's in the back seat of the car.
Yes.
Better still, tell his mate's mother and have her tell him, and you have this reciprocal thing going. You tell her kid, she tells your kid.
Yeah.
But so for, you know, stories and things like that are such a great way to, you know, have that sort of incidental conversation in a really, and like you say, child-friendly way. With a 6-year-old, you're not going to jump into the, you know, the really horrible stuff. But it is, in my experience, you're right, it is inevitable, because, you know, parents say, oh, Holly, my child would never look at pornography, or we've got every, you know, filtering system up the wazoo. Yeah, but the kid across the road doesn't. The kid on the bus doesn't. The kid on the play date doesn't. And so for me, open communication, and one of the things we have, so our program's based around two themes. We all have the right to feel safe all of the time, and we can talk to someone about anything. And if parents aren't having those anything talks, then it sends it underground.
Yeah. And there's so many, the disclosure thing I found really interesting when writing the book. For me, it was, I didn't want to get in trouble. I felt like I was evil or deviant in some way. Then as I got older and there was still probably things that could have been done in terms of early intervention therapy that might have been really beneficial in hindsight. Then I was worried about breaking her heart, my mum. But then the other part of it, mine was a boy in the neighborhood. Many, many cases are someone in the extended family or someone known to the family who's trusted by the family. And there's a whole element of kids not wanting to get that person in trouble in a way, because even though what's happened is awful, they still love them, or they like them, or they see their parents love them.
Yeah.
And so that's where being uninformed or kind of tiptoeing around these things is so dangerous, because like I don't want to invite a monster into my house. I want to know that that person's a monster, and empower my kid to feel safe enough to say whatever about that person that makes them uncomfortable. And that's the reality that I think, to come back to being comfortable with not sugarcoating things, parents need to face the horrible reality that these predators or perpetrators aren't the boogeyman in the dark shadows. They are 9 times out of 10, probably even more, 9.5 times out of 10, someone that you already know.
And in the stuff that I've read, most experts believe about 45% of all child sexual abuse is either children to children or teenagers on children.
Yeah.
And I haven't got all the way through your book, so I'm not sure on all of the cases, but was there any sibling survivors that you spoke?
No sibling, but some of that sort of teenage on child stuff, but in kind of trying to reconcile what happened to me. And a big part of the journey, as much as I hate that word, a big part of my work was kind of figuring out whether I accepted that what happened to me was abuse, because I didn't. And that's
I found that interesting in your book when you said that.
Yeah, for a number of reasons. One, that I was still carrying decades later this guilt and this belief that I'd done something wrong. Then it was like knowing from my work and engaging with this topic, knowing how many horrendous things happened and feeling like I wasn't worthy of being in that same category. But then I think mostly, if I'm honest about it, that kind of that reluctance to, if I say that this was abuse, then that opens a whole kettle of fish, and I have to really dive into this in a big, meaningful way, which is what I did in the end. Spoiler alert, but it was quite a healing thing. But the child on child thing kind of helped me come to terms with that, because I realized how common it is. And I also realized how, like, no one really knows how to talk about it, even those who've worked in this field for decades, who have every degree you can possibly get. They kind of admitted to feeling really uncertain about how to treat this thing. No one wants to take another child and treat them like a perpetrator. It's a bit of a gray area. If a 30 or a 40 or a 50-year-old man abuses a child, that's the most black and white thing in society. That's awful. It's the worst thing you can do. It's a crime. Off to jail you go, if you're lucky in the justice system. But for a child on child or peer on peer abuse, there are many shades of grey, and that makes people uncomfortable. The consequence of not figuring this out is that children end up like I did, full of shame, full of insecurity, a lot of self-loathing, and a kind of life that is lived very precariously without intervention. So it's a complex area. And Michael Salter has been really helpful in kind of me accepting it. And I think it was on the drum, actually, that he said something that I was like, damn it, I wanted that for the book, but I didn't get it. But he said, kids do doctors and nurses. They do, you have a penis, I have a vagina, and that's kind of normal and healthy. and they'll do it openly, or they'll talk about it. That's normal. That's natural age appropriate experimentation or whatever. It's when it goes underground and they feel like they need to keep it a secret, or they feel shameful or upset about it, and they worry about what happens if anyone ever knows. That's when there's a problem.
Yeah.
So that kind of that clear-cut way of thinking about it was also really helpful for me.
And yeah, because you show me yours, I'll show you mine at 6, when there's no power in difference, but there was a power in difference with you, wasn't there? And it also sounded like one of the things I know I need to work on more is creating more stuff around grooming, because it sounds like even though he was 9, is that right?
Yeah.
There was still a sort of a grooming process.
Totally. And that's hard to resist when you're a child. Like I think the thing you're talking about is the Sega, video game console. That's, I'm sorry, I can't say no to that. That adds another layer, and it's even though he was a child, he knew how to push buttons, which is both sad and kind of scary. And if it was a different time and we'd been better equipped to know what was going on, and if our parents kind of knew, and if things were far less of a taboo, not only would I have been supported, but he also would have been supported. And there was clearly something very wrong going on in his life, because I don't believe that any child is born evil, where they seek out to do this. That is the result of something else. And that makes me sad a bit. And so we all would have benefited from education and awareness.
So you sought him out though, didn't you? Haven't you met?
Yeah, as part of the book, the worst part of the book. Although in the end it was quite cathartic. I sought him out. The kind of COVID restrictions and lockdowns gave me a little bit of an easy, cheap way out, where I did it on Facebook rather than the original plan, which was to find him physically and drive up to his house and have a face-to-face conversation. I think doing it virtually also provided him a little bit more, not confidence, but I guess took away some of the starkness that a face-to-face meeting might have done. And we had a really candid conversation. I expected, as a cynical journalist, that he would pretend he didn't remember anything, that nothing had happened, but he remembered it vividly. The really interesting thing for me was that he had never in his life thought about it in a negative way. He just thought it was something that it was like kids play and it happened, and that was it. He assured me he'd never done it again with anyone else. He hasn't done anything since. But there were some really interesting things that he did say, which is that he's never been in a relationship ever in his life. He considers himself heterosexual, but is kind of just really unsure about how to approach women or normal, healthy adult relationships. And that he was not abused as a boy, but he was in an extremely violent and unstable household. And so I think, based on kind of gut feel and remembering how horrible his home life was, and also talking to experts, that this was still acting out based on trauma, but on a different kind of trauma.
And it's that power and control.
Yeah. Trying to take back some power in a really powerless and hopeless existence.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because 2 weeks ago we had on the ABC the documentary on Four Corners called Incel, about Incel. Did you see that?
Yeah.
My gosh, it just blew my mind. I just feel for young men. They're lost. We've got so many across the world, young men that are lost. And how do we support them? And so can you tell us more about your other book, your 14? Because
so 14 is about me at 14, not the world's most creative title, but growing up gay in regional Queensland in the late 90s, when that was kind of about the worst thing that you could be, especially at an all-boys NRL mad Catholic school, like the one I was unfortunate enough to find myself in. So the book is kind of about how how horrendously difficult that year was. A lot of physical violence, a lot of kind of mental and emotional torment, but how I survived it. And it is quite a hopeful book. But there are themes in that were loosely inspired by what happened to me when I was a boy. When I wrote the first book, I had zero intention of ever talking about this, of ever telling anybody, including my husband, in any meaningful way. I just wanted to keep this little box sealed and not unleash Pandora. But there were still elements in hindsight that I kind of fall back on now, like masculinity and the insecurities about how I was shaping up as a man, and that sense that, you know, being gay was so horrible, not just because of the social circumstances that I was in at that time, but also because of what had happened to me. And I have to tell you that prevailed for decades after that, well into my 20s, when I was on the outside a very proud and content gay man. Internally, I still felt like if I could flick a switch or take a pill and undo all of this, I maybe on a certain day I would. That's no way to live. It's a really self-destructive thing to grapple with. And I think that is the result of another really uncomfortable realization, which was that from about the age of 5, I began hating myself. And that's so horrible. You know, I think even saying it out loud now, I almost see that 5-year-old as another person, you know, like an out of body experience. And I just feel such heartache for him, and such, you know, I wish I could go back in time, because this stuff can be really self-destructive.
And how do we support young men? I mean, they're sitting in their, you know, on their computers talking with other young men. It's almost like they're being indoctrinated into this hating women and hating themselves.
I think they are. They're looking for somewhere to belong because they feel like they don't. And I think that's the byproduct of a lot of things. Yeah, I would not be an adolescent, well, in general, but an adolescent boy for all the money in the world, because, you know, social media is just the worst. And, you know, having the entire world in their pocket, including all of the evils of it, is really worrying and distressing. But then just young men feeling like, for all the progress we've made, that, you know, they still can't quite be their authentic selves, particularly when they're struggling. And that if they are struggling, unfortunately, despite all the investment, there's no place to go, particularly if you're in a regional area or an outer suburb. So I think the way we support men is give, particularly these men that have been sucked into kind of a really scary and unsafe world, but a world that makes them feel welcome. I think the antidote to that is to create spaces where young men feel welcome, whatever it is. Traditionally, it's been sport or a sporting team. I hate to generalize, but I'm willing to bet that these particular boys that respond to the incel stuff are not playing footy. Like, we need to engage them in a different way.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's common, I think, regardless of the age of the man. Men are overwhelmingly unlikely to ever seek support for a mental health issue, regardless of their age, whether they grew up in the city or the bush, whether they're from money or not, their ethnicity or culture. It doesn't matter. They are more likely to just push on and she'll be right. The outcome of that is that men make up 75% of suicides in this country, and that figure has not budged for all of the awareness campaigns and special days and morning teas and even, you know, certain amounts of money invested in men's mental health. That figure hasn't shifted, and it's in fact edging upwards in recent years. I am one of the most well-adjusted men that you'll ever meet, very emotionally in tune, very open to therapy and self-improvement. I, at times, have found it really uncomfortable to sit in an uncomfortable designer European chair in a therapist's office that I'm paying $380 a week for, surrounded by obnoxious artworks, and talk to a stranger about all the crazy shit that's going on in my head. Imagine an actual bloke, he's not going to walk into that scenario. So we need to meet these men where they are. And there are examples, many of which I've encountered, where there's a group that works with tradies, because tradies are 6 times more likely to suicide than any other profession, where these mental health groups go to a Bunnings at 7 a.m, make bacon and egg rolls, give them out for free to these tradies on their way to the site or whatever, and they're wrapped in a sheet on a different topic related to men's mental health, with support numbers on there, or links to support groups that are really casual and informal and blokey. That's what you've got to do. You've got to go to these men, adolescent or not, and meet them where they are and offer them a type of support that is non-threatening, but still effective.
Yes, definitely. I'm really blessed to have been in 84 remote communities across Australia, and I've run 88 workshops with solely Aboriginal men. And I've had Aboriginal men disclose their sexual abuse. And, earlier you said about having a safe place. Here's people, white people say to me, you can't talk to men about that sort of stuff. That's not culturally appropriate. The fellas say, Holly, we like you because you tell us straight away. And they're our kids too, and we need to know this.
Yeah.
And I can't get them to leave, to be honest. No, you're right, miss, keep going, you're a funny one. But they open up, and they're so desperate to talk. In the last one I've just done recently, there were men probably just a little bit younger than me, and there were 7 of them. And by the end of it, they were, talking about, oh, back in our day, girlie, porn was in a magazine. And, the way they spoke to me, nobody would have ever spoken to these men like I did. But they're lost. And, even with their culture, they tell me things that they shouldn't probably tell me. And they know that I'll never repeat it, sort of thing. But they just want to be heard, and they want the skills to be able to be good dads, but nobody's going out there. And when I'm working with all young people in remote schools, there are no services, there's no SARC or anything like that. So the only thing, probably the best gift I give the children, is I physically ring the kids' helpline. And they are just my heroes.
Yeah.
Because I've had so many bush kids, ring the kids' helpline, and the fact that once they find a counsellor, they're never going to get to sit in a posh Scandinavian chair. but once they find the counsellor that they connect with, they can keep having that same person. They don't have to keep telling their story to every man and his dog. And so, when I leave, I give the men 1300 yarn and all of these numbers, because it's hard enough in regional, but go remote, there's nothing out there for these people. And for the first time, here is somebody talking to them about pornography and all of the things that, the cyber. So every community I've been in, I was in 22 last year, 29 the year before. Every community I was in, I was being told about a romance scam and how people are giving away money to either American GI boyfriend or a Nigerian prince or a lady from the Philippines. And so, there's so much that we need to do around education.
Yeah. And talking is it sounds really basic, but it's not, because the moment you make someone feel like they're not alone, that what's happened to them isn't, they're the only person that has experienced it, and that there's, comfort to be found. It's like breaking a damn wall, I've had so many emails about this book from men who have never told anyone and probably never will, but have sought out this book, often discreetly on an ebook or an audio book. And, they've just emailed me and said the most wonderful things about the impact of the book, but also what's happened to them and how they feel about themselves and life and the world. And that's one random stranger writing one book, and it has an impact. So it's visibility, it's feeling seen and heard, and it's feeling safe enough to say something.
And I love the title. How did you come up with the title?
In therapy. So it was sort of,
You made me this way is the title, and it's so good.
I went off to therapy. I'd started dating this bloke, and for the first time in probably my adult life, I felt quite safe and very invested in like not stuffing this up. And he's a psychologist, and he, after several months, sort of suggested that maybe there were just a few little things that I should look into. And
A little tweak.
and I just thought, no, I'm amazing. Like I'm super well adjusted, and there's nothing wrong with me. But you know, I'll go and see this guy a few times and tick the box, and then I never have to do this again because I'm fine. I'm great. And then I think 20 minutes into the first session, I was crying hysterically, and I never cry. Um, but over the course of pretty much every session, there was some sort of revelation that came from just talking, and I would understand a little bit more about why I am the way I am. I was always very conscious not to kind of use it as an excuse, but just an explanation of how did I get here? Like, why do I have great friends and an amazing job and now this, you know, loving partner, but I just feel like I want to implode my life, or I feel angry sometimes when I shouldn't, or I feel bitterly sad for no reason, or alone, like the most lonely person in the world when I'm surrounded by everyone. And I just, these little pieces, bit by bit, kind of made this very compelling jigsaw puzzle. And that's where the title of the book ultimately came from, because so much of me all traced back to that afternoon in a bedroom in central Queensland when I was 5.
But you didn't, am I right in the book? You didn't actually mean to tell? Didn't it just slip out?
Yeah, I
You
don't
sort
even
of,
know. I don't know where. I honestly had zero intention, even in therapy. And this is months into this. I went to far more than 2 sessions in the end because I found it so useful. I was seeing this guy for years. Uh, and eventually I just blurted it out, and I don't even know why. Because I really, really just never wanted to touch this thing. And there's, you know, to be hopeful, because the book is heavy and the title is daunting, but ripping the lid off this thing is one of the best things I've ever done. Not only do I understand so much more about me, but I've met incredible men who are very inspiring and make me feel seen and heard. It's, you know, and it's also led to healing. You know, finding tools to get through the bad days or the tough weeks, and just kind of feeling much less harsh towards myself, shall we say. Learning to become friends with me, which is not as easy as it sounds, and not an uncommon experience for men like me. So, you know, it was well worth whatever inspired that day, and the years that have followed.
well, I'm very glad that you wrote it because I think it'll, you know, really help a lot more men. I might actually even some of the quotes, write them down to actually share with the men that I'm working with out bush, because when I go into a community, it's a whole of community approach. So I'm there to work with the children, but I run a women's session and a men's session, and I probably get 3 times as many men to my sessions as I do the women, and
Amazing.
they just love it because, you know, they want to open up, but and it's also the way that I do it. I don't go in naming, blaming, and shaming. And because we had the intervention in the Northern Territory, I do a lot of work in the Northern Territory. People say, "Look, Holly, why wasn't your program part of the intervention?" Because, you know, I go in and say, "This is what I'm teaching your children. Thought you'd like to know about it." So it's done with the utmost respect. I
Yeah.
mean, we have a laugh, and we, you know, sometimes they get a bit smutty, and I get a bit smutty, and that's all good, all part of it. But, you know, they want to be good dads, and we need to give everybody the tools.
Yeah.
So this, I think, is a marvelous tool. So I really thank you for your time, for speaking with
Thank you.
us.
So great to talk to you. Thank you for all that you do as well. It's just so vitally important.
And yeah, I look forward to, I'm going to go and try and find some of your articles on porn, because that's all I ever talk about is porn
Yeah.
usually. So I really appreciate you, yeah, spending your time with me. Thank you.
Thank you. So great to chat.